The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly under a sky black with storm clouds as Dr. Marcus Homo pulled his damaged truck toward the weathered barn. Lightning split the darkness behind him, illuminating the corporate mercenaries who'd been hunting him for 3 days. Inside his jacket, the stolen hard drive containing Gene Tech's classified research felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The barn door creaked open to reveal something that made his blood freeze. Dozens of donkeys stood in perfect formation, their eyes reflecting an intelligence that shouldn't exist. They didn't flee or bray, they simply watched him with an awareness that chilled him to the bone. Marcus recognized those eyes. He'd seen them before, in the lab animals during his illegal consciousness transfer experiments. The ones that were supposed to have been destroyed 5 years ago, the ones that had nearly cost him everything. As thunder crashed overhead, the lead donkey stepped forward and began scratching symbols in the dirt, symbols that spelled out his real name, the name he'd buried along with his past. But how could these creatures know who he really was, and what did they want with the man who had given them minds they were never meant to possess? Marcus stumbled backward, his shoulders slamming against the barn door. The storm raged behind him, but nothing compared to the tempest brewing in his mind. Those experiments had been conducted in a classified facility 3 states away. Every subject had been terminated when the program shut down. He'd verified the disposal records himself before fleeing to his new identity. Yet here they stood, or creatures exactly like them, arranged in rows like students in a lecture hall. Their elongated ears twitched in unison, responding to sounds his human hearing couldn't detect. The lead donkey, a graying female with knowing brown eyes, completed her message in the dirt, Dr. Samuel Krensky. That name hit him like a physical blow. Samuel Krensky had died in a lab fire 5 years ago, along with all evidence of Project Mindbridge. Marcus Homo had emerged from those ashes with forged credentials and a manufactured history. Only 3 people knew the truth, and 2 of them were dead. The third worked for Gene Tech. His hands trembled as he reached for the barn door, ready to face the storm and the mercenaries rather than confront this impossible reunion. But the lead donkey, he found himself thinking of her as Alpha, shook her massive head and stepped sideways, blocking his path. The others shifted with military precision, forming a wall between him and the exit. "What do you want?" Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. Alpha's response came not as sound, but as action. She moved to a corner of the barn where hay bales were stacked against the wall. With deliberate movements, she began pushing them aside, revealing a hidden panel underneath. The other donkeys watched this revelation with the intense focus of creatures who understood cause and effect far beyond their species' natural capacity. Marcus approached slowly, his scientific curiosity warring with primal fear. Behind the panel lay a collection of items that shouldn't exist, research files bearing his old letterhead, photographs from classified experiments, and a hard drive labeled Backup Protocol 7. His breathing became shallow. Backup Protocol 7 had been his insurance policy, a complete record of every consciousness transfer he'd performed, stored in a location known only to him. He'd hidden it before the lab burned, planning to retrieve it once the heat died down. But when he'd returned months later, the hiding place was empty. He'd assumed Gene Tech's cleanup crew had found it. Alpha nudged the drive toward him with her muzzle, then returned to the dirt floor. This time, her scratching was more elaborate, creating what looked like a crude map. Marcus recognized the geographic features, the Wyoming basin marked with X's at specific locations. 7 marks total, 7 other facilities. The implications hit him like ice water. Gene Tech hadn't just covered up his research, they'd expanded it. The consciousness transfer technology he'd pioneered as a theoretical exercise in animal cognition had been weaponized and deployed. These donkeys weren't his original subjects, they were part of something much larger. Vehicle headlights swept across the barn's exterior walls, visible through gaps in the weathered wood. The mercenaries had found him. Marcus grabbed the backup drive, his mind racing through possibilities. The stolen Gene Tech data in his jacket contained proof of illegal human experiments, but this older drive held something potentially more damaging. The foundational research that made those experiments possible. Alpha and her herd moved with synchronized purpose, some positioning themselves near the rear of the barn, while others approached the main doors. Their coordination spoke of shared consciousness, collective decision-making that transcended individual animal intelligence. "You're not just enhanced," Marcus breathed, understanding flooding through him. "You're networked." The lead donkey met his gaze and nodded once, a distinctly human gesture that confirmed his worst fears and greatest scientific achievement simultaneously. Outside, boots crunched on gravel as the hunting party surrounded the barn. Marcus clutched both hard drives against his chest, caught between the storm of his past and the approaching tempest of his present. Whatever gene tech had created here was beyond his original vision, and these creatures seemed determined to make him face the consequences of opening Pandora's box. The barn doors exploded inward, and everything changed forever. The donkeys hadn't moved, not a single step. They stood in perfect formation, their dark eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Rain hammered against the barn's metal roof, but inside, the silence stretched between them like a held breath. Marcus forced himself to count them. 12, arranged in 3 rows of 4, as if they were posing for a photograph. Their coats ranged from deep brown to pale grey, but their posture was identical, heads raised, ears forward, absolutely still, no casual grazing, no shuffling, no typical herd dynamics, just that unnerving collective focus. "Easy," he whispered, more to himself than to them. The word felt ridiculous the moment it left his lips. These weren't spooked animals that needed calming. They were studying him. The closest donkey, a stocky brown female with a white blaze, took a single deliberate step forward. Marcus tensed, but she stopped, tilting her head with what could only be described as curiosity. Her nostrils flared slightly, and Marcus realized she was memorizing his scent. Lightning illuminated the barn's interior again, revealing details he'd missed in his initial panic. The stalls weren't just clean, they were organized with surgical precision. Water troughs positioned at exact intervals, hay distributed in perfect portions, not a single piece of equipment out of place. Someone had maintained this space with obsessive care. But there was something else. Along the back wall, partially hidden in shadow, stood what looked like computer equipment. The blue glow he'd noticed earlier came from a series of monitors, their screens alive with scrolling data he couldn't read from this distance. The brown donkey took another step, and Marcus noticed something that made his breath catch. Around her neck, barely visible beneath her thick mane, was a thin collar, not leather or rope, but something metallic that caught the light with a dull sheen. As his eyes adjusted, he could see that all of them wore similar collars. "Who are you?" The voice hit him like a physical blow. Marcus spun toward the sound, his heart hammering, but saw only the empty doorway behind him. The storm had intensified, turning the world beyond the barn into a wall of grey water. "No one down here, Dr. Chen." The voice was coming from below, from the donkeys. Marcus felt reality tilt sideways as the brown female stepped closer, her mouth moving with deliberate precision. The sounds emerging weren't brays or calls. They were words, spoken with careful articulation despite the obvious limitations of her vocal apparatus. "That's impossible," Marcus said, backing toward the wall. "Many things seem impossible until they're not," replied a different voice. A grey donkey from the second row had spoken, his tone carrying what sounded like amusement. "Genetic modification can achieve remarkable results, as you well know." The barn suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. Marcus pressed his back against the rough wood, his mind racing through explanations, hallucination from the stress and cold, some kind of speaker system hidden in the shadows, anything except what his eyes and ears were telling him. "You're frightened," observed the brown female. "Understandable. We had similar reactions when we first became aware of what we'd become." "What you'd become," Marcus repeated numbly. "You're saying you remember before?" "Fragments," said another voice, this one from a smaller donkey near the back. "Impressions. The transformation process doesn't preserve everything, but enough remains to know we weren't always like this. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Transformation process. You mean you were human? The collective silence that followed was answer enough. 12 pairs of intelligent eyes watched him process the implications, and Marcus felt the weight of his own research pressing down on him. The project he'd walked away from 5 years ago. The experiments that had gone too far. The files he'd destroyed before disappearing into academic obscurity. Dr. Chen, the brown female said gently, we know who you are. We know what you've done. I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus said, but the words felt hollow even to him. Project synthesis, said the grey donkey. Neural pathway integration, consciousness transfer protocols. You were the lead researcher before you disappeared. The barn seemed to spin around Marcus. Project synthesis had been theoretical, just computer models and cellular samples. They'd never moved to live subjects. He'd made sure of that before he'd burned everything and vanished. That project was terminated, he said weakly. Your portion was, corrected another voice, but Dr. Vance continued the work, refined it, perfected it. Marcus felt his legs give out. He slid down the wall until he was sitting in the straw, staring at 12 impossible creatures that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist. That represented everything he'd tried to prevent. He's still working, the brown female continued, her voice carrying something that might have been sadness. And now that he knows you're here, he'll want his star researcher back. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills like approaching artillery. The barn's interior stretched further than physics should have allowed, disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow Marcus's flashlight beam. The musty smell of hay mixed with something else. Ozone, sharp and electric, like the air after lightning strikes. His boots squelched against wooden planks that felt strangely warm beneath the layers of ancient dust. The donkeys watched him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. Their eyes tracked his movement with predatory focus, pupils dilated despite the light he cast across their faces. When he counted them, the number kept shifting. 7, 9, 12, as if they multiplied in his peripheral vision. Marcus pulled out his satellite phone, muscle memory overriding rational thought. No signal. The device's screen flickered with static patterns that hurt to look at directly. He tried the GPS function. The coordinates displayed impossible numbers, longitude and latitude readings that placed him simultaneously in 3 different countries. What the hell? He whispered. The nearest donkey's ears swiveled toward the sound. Its mouth opened, revealing teeth filed to sharp points. Not naturally worn, deliberately shaped. The creature made a sound that started as a bray, but ended as something almost conversational, like words spoken in a language his brain couldn't quite process. Marcus backed toward the entrance, but his shoulder struck solid wood. He spun around. The barn door was gone. Where it should have been stood another wall, weathered planks identical to the rest of the structure. His heart hammered against his ribs as he ran his hands across the surface, searching for any crack or seam. Nothing. The impossible space stretched around him, barn stalls extending in directions that violated Euclidean geometry. Some contained more donkeys. Others held equipment that belonged in a laboratory. Stainless steel tables, banks of monitors displaying scrolling data, centrifuges humming with mechanical precision. The technology looked decades advanced beyond anything in his classified briefings. A soft whirring drew his attention to the rafters above. Cameras, dozens of them, lenses rotating to track his movement. Red recording lights blinked in synchronized patterns, creating a constellation of surveillance in the barn's upper reaches. Someone was watching. Someone had been expecting him. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly, drawing on training that seemed inadequate for this situation. The extinct species documentation in his files had been thorough. Population decline graphs, final habitat surveys, confirmed last sightings. The Sardinian dwarf donkey had succumbed to a hemorrhagic fever that swept through every remaining herd in 18 months. He'd read the necropsy reports. seen the photographs of mass graves on remote Mediterranean islands. Yet here they stood, not just alive but thriving, and changed. One of the creatures approached the stall gate, its hooves making no sound against the barn floor. Up close, Marcus could see the modifications more clearly. Surgical scars traced precise lines along the animal's skull. Metallic implants glinted beneath patches of missing fur. Its eyes held a liquid intelligence that seemed almost human. The donkey's mouth moved with deliberate precision, forming sounds that couldn't possibly emerge from its throat anatomy. "You're late," it said. Marcus stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The beam rolled across the ground, casting wild shadows that made the watching animals appear to dance. His mind struggled to process what he'd heard, not just speech, but words delivered in his own language, with his own regional accent. "The storm delayed you," the creature continued, its voice gaining clarity with each syllable. "We've been waiting since Tuesday. This isn't possible." Marcus's voice cracked. "You're extinct, dead, gone." The donkey's scarred head tilted, studying him with scientific curiosity. "Extinction is a human concept, linear, primitive. We've moved beyond such limitations." Other voices joined the conversation, a chorus of extinct animals speaking in perfect unison. "The files you carry contain only fragments, deliberately incomplete data. Your government knows we survived." Marcus's hand moved instinctively toward the encrypted drive in his jacket pocket. The gesture didn't go unnoticed. Every eye in the barn focused on the movement, dozens of modified creatures watching with predatory attention. "They sent you to verify," the first donkey said. "But verification was never the true purpose of your mission." The laboratory equipment hummed louder, displays showing biological data that scrolled too fast for human comprehension. Charts tracking genetic sequences, evolutionary timelines, population growth projections. The numbers painted a picture that made Marcus's blood run cold. "What do you want?" he managed. "Nothing from you," the creature replied. "You're simply the delivery mechanism, the catalyst for the next phase." Marcus felt something warm spreading across his palm. When he looked down, thin rivulets of blood seeped from cuts he didn't remember receiving. The metallic smell mixed with the ozone, creating an atmosphere thick with copper and electricity. The barn walls began to pulse with their own light, bioluminescent patterns spreading like neural networks through the wood grain. Whatever was happening, whatever he'd stumbled into, it had been orchestrated long before the storm forced him to seek shelter. The extinct donkeys watched and waited, their modified eyes reflecting light that seemed to come from within. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus spread the classified files across his hotel room desk, each document stamped with security clearances that could end careers if mishandled. 3 years of meticulous documentation chronicling the systematic extinction of Equus asinus, the common donkey. Hemorrhagic fever, they'd called it. A viral outbreak that swept through domestic populations worldwide with surgical precision, leaving no survivors. Marcus rubbed his temples, the memory of those braying voices still echoing in his ears. Impossible didn't begin to cover what he'd witnessed in that barn. He'd counted at least 30 animals, all healthy, all very much alive. The implications crawled down his spine like ice water. His secure phone buzzed. "Director Hawthorne. Chen, I need your preliminary report. The Agriculture Committee is breathing down my neck about the Riverside facility." Marcus stared at the files, his finger tracing the edge of a photograph showing piles of dead donkeys being incinerated in Peru. "Sir, I need more time. There are complications." "What kind of complications?" "It's a simple biological assessment." The lie came easier than it should have. "Contamination concerns. I want to run additional soil samples before giving the all-clear." Through the rain-streaked window, he could see the distant glow of the Riverside property. "I'll need another 48 hours." Hawthorne's silence stretched long enough for Marcus to wonder if the call had dropped. "You found something," the director said finally. It wasn't a question. "I found anomalies that require investigation. Chen, I've known you for 6 years. You don't request extensions for soil samples. What did you find out there? Marcus closed his eyes. Hawthorne had recruited him personally, pulled him from academic obscurity after his dissertation on genetic bottlenecks had caught the attention of certain government circles. But trust only extended so far when dealing with classified materials that could reshape fundamental understanding of biological systems. Give me 2 days, sir. If I'm wrong, no harm done. If I'm right... He let the sentence hang. 48 hours, Chen, not a minute more. The line went dead. Marcus sat back, studying the extinction reports with fresh eyes. The official narrative painted a picture of rapid viral spread, overwhelming veterinary response capabilities. But now, examining the data with scientific skepticism rather than bureaucratic acceptance, inconsistencies emerged like cracks in a facade. The timeline was too clean. Outbreaks occurring simultaneously across continents with no obvious transmission vectors. Genetic analysis of the virus showed impossible stability, no mutations, no adaptations, as if it had been engineered rather than evolved. Most disturbing were the recovery reports. 0 survivors, not one resistant individual in the entire global population. Nature didn't work that way. There were always survivors, always genetic variants that provided resistance. Always. Marcus pulled up satellite imagery of the riverside property, studying the layout with new purpose. The barn where he'd encountered the donkeys sat at the center of a complex that included several outbuildings, a main house, and what appeared to be laboratory facilities. No ordinary farm, then. His laptop chimed with an encrypted message from his research assistant at the CDC. The soil samples he'd actually collected were showing unusual isotopic signatures, elements that shouldn't exist in standard agricultural settings, trace amounts of rare earth metals typically associated with advanced electronics or experimental technologies. The pieces refused to form a coherent picture. Extinct animals thriving in secret, military-grade security at a supposedly abandoned facility, unusual isotopes in the soil, and underlying it all, the nagging certainty that he'd stumbled onto something that powerful people had worked very hard to keep hidden. Marcus downloaded the satellite images to his encrypted drive, cross-referencing property records and ownership documentation. Riverside Biological Research had been a government contractor specializing in agricultural genetics before the donkey extinction. Their final project reports were heavily redacted, but the visible fragments mentioned temporal stability protocols and retroactive genetic intervention. The terms meant nothing to him, but they carried the weight of classified science, research conducted beyond the boundaries of published knowledge. His phone rang again. Unknown number. Dr. Chen? The voice was female, nervous. I think we need to talk about what you saw at the barn. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Who is this? My name is Sarah Winters. I worked at Riverside before the shutdown. I know why those animals are still alive, and I know what's really going to happen when your people come back to investigate. How did you get this number? The same way I know you've been lying to your superiors for the past 6 hours. Dr. Chen, those donkeys aren't the only species that didn't actually go extinct. And if the wrong people realize what's happening at Riverside, a lot more than careers are going to end. The line went quiet except for the sound of rain against her window. She was close, somewhere in town. There's a diner called Murphy's on Highway 7, she said. 1 hour. Come alone and bring whatever files you're looking at. Trust me, you're going to need help understanding what you've walked into. The donkeys formed a perfect semicircle around Marcus, their dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He pressed his back against the barn wall, feeling splinters dig through his jacket. The storm continued to rage outside, but the sound seemed distant now, overwhelmed by the thundering of his own heartbeat. One of the animals stepped forward, the same grey mare that had first approached him. In the dim light filtering through the gaps in the barn walls, Marcus could see something that defied everything he knew about equine anatomy. The creature's skull was subtly different, broader across the forehead, and those eyes held a depth of intelligence that belonged in a human face, not on a farm animal. "This isn't possible," he whispered, his voice cracking. The grey mare tilted her head in response, and Marcus could swear he saw recognition flicker across her features. She took another step closer, and he noticed something else that made his blood run cold, a small scar above her left ear, surgical in its precision, the kind of mark left behind by a cranial implant. His mind raced back to the Meridian Project, to those final weeks before everything had gone wrong. The neural enhancement protocols, the cognitive amplification trials, the subjects they had used in the early phases before the human trials began. "No," he breathed, shaking his head violently. "We destroyed everything, all the data, all the specimens, the fire." The mare made a sound then, not quite a bray, but something more complex, almost like speech trying to form in a throat not designed for human language. Other donkeys began to respond, creating a chorus of those strange, almost words that sent ice through Marcus's veins. He fumbled for his phone, desperate to document what he was seeing, but his hands were shaking too badly to operate the device. The screen lit up briefly before slipping from his fingers and clattering to the hay-strewn floor. The donkeys didn't startle at the sound, another sign of their unnaturally enhanced cognition. The grey mare approached his fallen phone, studying it with obvious curiosity. She nosed it gently, and Marcus watched in horrified fascination as she seemed to understand its purpose. Her movements were deliberate, intelligent, nothing like the random exploration of a normal animal. "You remember, don't you?" Marcus found himself saying, his scientific mind overriding his fear. "You remember the lab, the procedures?" At the word procedures, several of the donkeys shifted restlessly, and Marcus caught sight of more scars, more surgical marks hidden beneath their coarse hair. His enhanced animals hadn't died in the fire that destroyed the Meridian facility. Somehow, impossibly, they had survived. But how had they ended up here, in this remote barn? And how had they maintained their cognitive enhancements for so long without the stabilizing treatments? A new thought struck him, more terrifying than the rest. If these animals had retained their enhanced intelligence, what else had they retained? What memories of their time in his laboratory were locked behind those two knowing eyes? The grey mare moved closer still, close enough that Marcus could feel her warm breath on his face. She studied him with the intensity of a researcher examining a specimen. Then, with movements that were far too deliberate for any ordinary animal, she reached out with her muzzle and touched the ID badge clipped to his jacket, the badge that still bore the Meridian Genetics logo. Recognition. Absolute, undeniable recognition. Marcus felt his knees give way, and he slumped against the wall. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I'm so sorry for what we did to you, for what I did." The mare stepped back, and for a moment Marcus thought he saw something almost like compassion in her expression. But then her lips pulled back, revealing yellowed teeth, and the sound she made was definitely not one of forgiveness. The other donkeys began to move, closing the semicircle tighter around him. Marcus realized with growing dread that he was no longer just a random stranger who had stumbled into their sanctuary. He was the architect of their transformation, the man responsible for turning them into something between animal and human, belonging fully to neither world. Thunder crashed overhead, and in that brief, brilliant flash of lightning that penetrated the barn, Marcus saw something that made his mind reel. Scratched into the dirt floor around where the animals typically gathered were symbols, crude but unmistakable letters and numbers, coordinates, dates, and in the center, spelled out in careful, deliberate marks, his name. They hadn't just survived the destruction of Meridian Genetics. They had been planning, waiting, and somehow they had drawn him here, to this isolated place where the storm would trap him with no chance of escape. The grey mare made that almost speech sound again, and this time Marcus could almost make out the words she was trying to form, two syllables that chilled him to the bone. Marcus. They remembered everything. Security footage from Dr. Chen's laboratory painted a picture that defied every rational explanation Marcus had constructed in his mind. On the grainy monitor, he watched himself approach the barn 3 nights ago, but the timestamp showed a date from 6 months in the future. The donkeys in the background moved in stuttering, unnatural rhythms, their forms occasionally flickering like damaged film. "Temporal displacement," Chen murmured, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. "The electromagnetic anomaly isn't just affecting local wildlife, it's creating pockets where time itself becomes unstable." Marcus felt his throat constrict. "That's impossible. Time doesn't work that way, doesn't it?" She pulled up another file, this one marked with symbols he didn't recognize. 3 years ago, Project Kronos was officially terminated after the Meridian incident. What the public doesn't know is that the experiment succeeded too well. We didn't just bend time, we shattered it. The laboratory hummed with hidden machinery, and Marcus realized the entire facility was much larger than it appeared. Through reinforced glass windows, he glimpsed corridors stretching deeper underground, filled with equipment that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. Chen noticed his wandering gaze and sealed the windows with the touch of a button. "The donkeys aren't just alive, Mr. Webb. They're echoes, temporal fragments from multiple timeline branches where the extinction never occurred. Each animal carries genetic markers from different probability streams." She gestured to a wall of monitors showing DNA sequences that writhed and shifted like living things. "Some have been dead for centuries in our timeline. Others were never born at all." Marcus backed away from the displays, his mind reeling. "The classified files I accessed, they showed the extinction was caused by a viral outbreak. Natural causes." "Natural?" Chen's laugh held no humor. "The outbreak was a cover story. We needed to explain why an entire species would suddenly phase out of existence. The real cause was temporal bleed-through from failed experiments. We were trying to prevent an extinction event and ended up causing it instead." A soft chime echoed through the laboratory, and Chen's expression shifted to one of urgent concern. She rushed to a communications panel where red lights blinked in rapid sequence. The voice that emerged from the speakers was distorted but unmistakably human. "Dr. Chen, we have a problem. The displacement field is expanding. Current radius now encompasses the entire county, and it's accelerating." Marcus watched Chen's face pale. "How long do we have?" "At current expansion rate, 12 hours before it reaches the nearest population center, 17 hours before it hits the state capital." Chen terminated the connection and turned to Marcus with desperate intensity. "I brought you here because you're not just a meteorologist. Your security clearance gave you access to files that prove you've been tracking these anomalies for the government. They've been using you to map temporal disturbances without telling you what you were really measuring." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. Every weather pattern he'd analyzed, every atmospheric disturbance he'd reported, all of it suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. "You're saying I've been working for them unknowingly? Your data has been invaluable in containing previous incidents, but this one is different. The barn isn't just a collection point for displaced animals. It's the epicenter of a temporal cascade that could unravel causality across the entire region." Chen led him to a massive display showing a 3-dimensional map of the surrounding area. Pulsing circles radiated outward from a point that corresponded exactly to the barn's location. Within each circle, timestamps flickered and changed, showing dates spanning decades. Every person caught in the field will experience temporal displacement. They'll exist simultaneously across multiple timelines, aging and dying, and being born in different sequences. Their memories will become scrambled across probability streams until they can no longer distinguish past from future. Marcus stared at the expanding circles, calculating the trajectory in his mind with the same analytical skills he'd applied to storm systems. "It's following atmospheric pressure gradients. The storm 3 nights ago, it didn't just bring me to the barn, it accelerated whatever process was already happening." "Exactly. And now the field is using natural weather patterns as a delivery mechanism. Unless we can collapse the temporal fracture at its source, the displacement effect will continue expanding until it encompasses the entire continent. The weight of the revelation settled on Marcus like a crushing tide. Everything he thought he knew about his work, his expertise, even his presence here had been orchestrated by forces he couldn't comprehend. But as he studied the data patterns on Chen's monitors, his trained meteorologist's eye began to detect something else, an underlying structure to the chaos that followed principles he recognized. "The expansion isn't random," he said slowly. "It's following predictable atmospheric dynamics. If we can map the pressure systems accurately enough, we might be able to predict exactly where and when the field will destabilize next." Chen's eyes widened with the first hope he'd seen her display. "And if we can predict it, we might be able to stop it." The facility's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Marcus followed Dr. Chen deeper into the underground complex. Their footsteps echoed against steel walls that seemed to pulse with each flicker of the backup generators. Behind them, the sounds of Dr. Reeves' security team grew fainter, but Marcus knew they wouldn't have long before being discovered. "This way," Chen whispered, her keycard trembling as she swiped it at another checkpoint. "The temporal lab is in sub-level C." "Temporal?" Marcus grabbed her arm. "What exactly have you people been doing here?" Chen's eyes darted nervously down the corridor. "What we thought was saving the world, what we now know was destroying it." They descended another flight of stairs, the air growing thicker with each level. Strange humming sounds emanated from behind sealed doors, punctuated by electronic beeps that seemed almost organic in their rhythm. Marcus noticed his watch had stopped working entirely, its hands frozen at 3:17. "It started 5 years ago," Chen continued as they walked. "The government contracted Helix Corporation to develop what they called biological insurance. The idea was simple: create genetic backups of endangered species before they went extinct. That sounds reasonable enough." It was, until we discovered the quantum field generators. Chen stopped at a massive vault door marked with biohazard symbols. "We weren't just preserving genetic material, we were creating temporal pockets, isolated spaces where time moved differently." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. You were running evolutionary experiments outside normal time streams. Accelerated evolution, controlled extinction, and revival events. We could compress millions of years of natural selection into months. Chen's voice grew hollow. "The donkeys were our first success story. We took them to the brink of extinction, then guided their evolution through multiple timeline branches." The vault door opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a chamber that defied physics. The space seemed larger inside than the building could possibly contain, its walls lined with observation windows that looked into what appeared to be different environments: Arctic tundra, tropical forest, desert wasteland. In each window, Marcus saw movement. "My God," he breathed. "Each viewport shows a different temporal pocket," Chen explained. "Different evolutionary pressures, different timeline velocities. We've been playing God with causality itself." Marcus approached the nearest window. Inside, he saw creatures that might have been horses once, but their elongated limbs and metallic-looking hide suggested millions of years of adaptation he was witnessing in real time. As he watched, one of the creatures seemed to notice him and pressed what might have been a face against the glass. Its eyes held an intelligence that made his skin crawl. "The donkeys you found escaped 3 months ago," Chen continued. "But they didn't escape into our timeline. They escaped into the wrong one, a timeline where their extinction never happened." "That's impossible." "Is it? Look around you, Agent Hayes. We've proven that evolution isn't just about biological adaptation, it's about temporal adaptation. Species don't just change physically, they change their relationship with time itself." Marcus moved to another viewport, this one showing what looked like the original barn where he'd found the donkeys. But something was wrong with the image. The barn appeared to be aging and rebuilding itself in rapid cycles, as if caught in some kind of temporal loop. The facility has been experiencing chronological bleeding, Chen said, following his gaze. Past and future versions of our experiments are starting to overlap. Yesterday, we found a research lab that won't be built for another 6 months. Last week, Dr. Rodriguez had a conversation with her own granddaughter, who doesn't exist yet. A new sound echoed through the facility. Not the harsh alarms they'd been hearing, but something else. Something that sounded almost like singing. Marcus realized it was coming from the temporal pockets themselves, as if the creatures inside were communicating across timelines. "There's more," Chen said, her voice barely audible above the ethereal chorus. "The evolutionary changes aren't random. The species we've been experimenting on are developing abilities that shouldn't be possible. Precognition, temporal manipulation. Some of them seem to exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. And the government knows about this? The government ordered this. They wanted biological weapons that could attack across time. Imagine being able to retroactively extinct your enemy's ancestors or accelerate the evolution of viruses to target specific genetic markers." Marcus felt sick, but something went wrong. Something went right, too right. The species became more than we intended. They started working together across temporal boundaries. The donkeys were just the beginning. They were scouts, testing whether they could survive in our baseline timeline. The singing grew louder, more complex, and Marcus realized it wasn't just communication. It was coordination. Every creature in every temporal pocket was participating in some vast, incomprehensible plan. "Dr. Chen," he said slowly, "where are the human test subjects?" Her silence was answer enough. The emergency lighting flickered once more, and when it stabilized, Marcus saw something that made his blood freeze. In the reflection of the viewport glass, standing behind them, was a figure that looked exactly like him, but older, scarred, wearing clothes he'd never seen before. The other Marcus smiled and spoke with his own voice. "Hello, past self, we need to talk." The metallic tang of fear coated Marcus's tongue as he stared at the crude symbols carved into the wooden beam. The donkeys had fallen silent, their collective gaze boring into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He reached up with trembling fingers to trace the markings, and the moment his flesh made contact with the wood, images exploded behind his eyes. Laboratory corridors, white coats, the acrid smell of formaldehyde and something else, something organic and wrong. His own voice, younger but unmistakably his, speaking into a recording device. "Subject batch Delta 7 shows unprecedented neural development, cognitive function exceeding baseline human parameters by 43%. Marcus jerked his hand away, gasping. The barn came rushing back into focus, but the donkeys had moved closer, much closer. They formed a perfect semicircle around him, their dark eyes reflecting the storm's lightning like obsidian mirrors. "That's impossible," he whispered, backing against the beam. "Those records were destroyed. Everything was destroyed." The largest donkey, the one that had touched his hand earlier, stepped forward. Its lips moved in a way that seemed almost deliberate, and Marcus realized with growing horror that it was trying to speak. The sounds that emerged were guttural, malformed, but unmistakably attempting to form words. Doc, tor, ma, cuss. The words hit him like physical blows. Marcus slid down the beam until he was sitting in the hay, his legs no longer able to support him. "You remember," he breathed. "God help me, you remember everything." The donkey that had spoken, Marcus found himself thinking of it as Subject 12, though he tried to push the designation away, nodded once. Slowly, deliberately. The intelligence behind its eyes was unmistakable now, terrible in its clarity. Thunder crashed overhead, but Marcus barely heard it. His mind was reeling through the implications. If they were here, if they had survived the fire that was supposed to have ended everything, then what else had survived? Who else knew? "How many of you are there?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Subject 12 turned its head toward the deeper shadows at the back of the barn. Marcus followed its gaze and felt his blood freeze. There were more eyes back there, dozens of them, reflecting the storm light like fallen stars. Jesus Christ! He scrambled to his feet, his back still pressed against the wooden beam. How long have you been here? How long have you been watching? Subject 12 made a sound that might have been an attempt at laughter. The noise sent ice through Marcus's veins. Other donkeys began moving out of the shadows, and he could see the variations in their development. Some bore the telltale signs of enhanced cranial capacity that had marked the later subjects. Others showed the elongated digital appendages that had been an unexpected side effect of the neural augmentation process. They had continued to develop, to evolve. "The farm," Marcus said, pieces clicking together in his mind. "This isn't abandoned at all, is it? You made them think it was abandoned. You've been hiding here." Subject 12's head moved in what could only be described as a nod. Then it did something that made Marcus's knees buckle. It raised one of its front hooves, now clearly more hand-like than he had initially realized, and pointed directly at him. "You came back," it managed to force out, each word a struggle against anatomy never meant for human speech. "Why? I didn't know," Marcus stammered. "I swear I didn't know you were here. The storm. I was just seeking shelter from the storm." The donkey's expression shifted, and Marcus saw something there that chilled him more than anger or hatred would have. Understanding. These creatures knew about coincidence versus intention. They had developed beyond mere intelligence into something approaching wisdom. "Dr. Chen," Subject 12 said, and Marcus's heart stopped completely. "What about Dr. Chen? She knows where we are." The barn seemed to tilt around Marcus. Sarah Chen, his former research partner, the one person who had escaped the facility before the fire, the one person who had taken copies of their research and vanished into the wind 15 years ago. If she knew where they were, if she had been monitoring them, "Is she coming here?" he asked. Lightning illuminated the barn in stark relief, and in that moment, Marcus saw them all clearly. Nearly 30 enhanced donkeys, their eyes filled with an intelligence that should never have existed, and every single one of them was looking at him with the same expression Subject 12 wore. They weren't just hiding from the world, they were waiting for something. "She comes tonight," Subject 12 said, and its mutated lips pulled back in what could only be described as a smile. "She brings others." The storm raged outside, but inside the barn the real tempest was just beginning. The safe house windows rattled against another gust of wind as Marcus spread the documents across the kitchen table. Elena stood behind him, her fingers drumming nervously against her coffee cup while he absorbed the magnitude of what she'd shown him. "The Lazarus Protocol," he whispered, reading the header again. "How many species are we talking about?" 47 confirmed resurrections, hundreds more in various stages of development. Elena's voice carried the weight of years keeping this secret. The donkeys were just the beginning, Marcus, a proof of concept before they moved on to bigger targets. Marcus flipped through photographs that seemed impossible. Tasmanian tigers prowling through laboratory corridors, passenger pigeons in flight chambers, woolly mammoths behind reinforced glass walls. Each image bore the same classified stamp, each dated within the last 5 years. "The temporal extraction process isn't resurrection in any traditional sense," Elena continued, settling into the chair across from him. "They're not rebuilding DNA or cloning from fragments. They're literally pulling these creatures from moments before their extinction events, creating quantum displacement bubbles that exist outside normal space-time. That's impossible. The energy requirements alone would be astronomical using conventional physics, yes, but they're not using conventional physics." Elena leaned forward, her eyes reflecting years of horror and fascination. "They've weaponized quantum entanglement on a macroscopic scale. The facility in Colorado isn't just a research lab, it's a temporal anchor point. Every creature they've extracted exists in a state of quantum flux, tethered to machines that keep them stable in our timeline." Marcus studied a schematic that looked more like theoretical physics than biology. Equations filled the margins, calculations that hurt his head to contemplate. What happens if the anchor fails? Cascade collapse. Every displaced creature snaps back to its original timeline, but the quantum scarring would be permanent. We'd tear holes in space-time itself. The implications crashed over him like a cold wave. The storm, the electromagnetic anomalies I've been tracking, are byproducts of the displacement field. Each extraction creates temporal fractures that bleed electromagnetic energy into our timeline. The more creatures they pull through, the more unstable our local space-time becomes. Marcus's hands shook as he turned to another document, this one outlining something called Project Genesis. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying. They're not just bringing back the extinct, they're planning to replace current species entirely. Think about it from their perspective, Elena said, her voice hollow. Modern animals carry genetic adaptations to human civilization, fear responses, behavioral modifications, evolutionary compromises, but creatures pulled from pre-human timelines, they're pure, uncontaminated by human influence, a complete ecological reset. Marcus felt sick. They're planning to extinct the present to resurrect the past. The donkeys were test subjects for behavioral integration studies. How would pre-extinction creatures adapt to modern environments? How would they interact with human populations? The barn you found was an observation facility disguised as a rescue operation. Outside, lightning illuminated the landscape in stark white flashes. Marcus counted the seconds until thunder rolled across the mountains. The storm was moving closer. Who's behind this? NSA? Pentagon? Deeper than that. A consortium of defense contractors, tech billionaires, and shadow government operations. They call themselves the Temporal Restoration Initiative. Their public face talks about conservation and species recovery, but their real agenda is complete biosphere replacement. Elena pulled out another file, this one marked with red security bands. They've already begun live testing with apex predators. 6 months ago, they extracted a pack of dire wolves from 30,000 years in the past. Last month, they brought through something they're calling Project Alpha, a predator from so far back in the timeline that it predates most known species. Marcus's blood went cold. Where are they now? Unknown. The dire wolves were released in remote wilderness areas for behavioral observation. Project Alpha, that's classified beyond my clearance level. But the energy signature from its extraction was off the charts. Whatever it is, it's massive. The lights flickered as another lightning strike hit somewhere nearby. In the brief darkness, Marcus thought he saw something move past the window, a shadow too large and swift to be natural wind-blown debris. Elena, how many people know about this? Maybe 50 worldwide with full clearance. Most of the technical staff only know their individual pieces. But Marcus, there's something else. Something I haven't told you yet. She pulled out a final document, this one bearing his photograph and security clearance number. His assignment to investigate the electromagnetic anomalies hadn't been random. It had been orchestrated. You were never meant to discover the donkeys by accident, Elena said quietly. You were led there. The storm, your route selection, even your GPS malfunction, it was all manipulated. Someone wanted you to find that barn. Marcus stared at his own face, looking back at him, from classified documents he'd never seen before. Why? What do they want from me? I don't know, but whoever's pulling the strings, they've been watching you for months. And now that you know about Lazarus, you're either an asset. She paused as another shadow passed the window, this one slower, more deliberate, or a liability they need to eliminate. The quantum field generator hummed with an otherworldly resonance that seemed to vibrate through Marcus's bones. Dr. Chen's fingers danced across holographic controls, adjusting parameters that existed somewhere between science and impossibly advanced technology. The barn around them felt smaller now, as if reality itself was contracting. The field is stabilizing, Chen announced, her voice tight with concentration. But we're running on borrowed time. The temporal variance is increasing exponentially. Marcus watched the donkeys, still impossibly calm, despite the growing energy crackling through the air. Their eyes held that same ancient intelligence, as if they understood what was happening better than any human present. Sarah crouched beside the youngest foal, her scanner beeping frantically. "The genetic markers are shifting again," she called out. "It's like their DNA is rewriting itself in real time." Agent Torres stepped closer to the central control node, his weapon lowered but ready. "Dr. Chen, I need to understand what we're dealing with. My orders were to contain this situation, but containment assumes we know what this actually is." Chen's laugh was bitter. "Containment? Agent Torres, you can't contain evolution itself. What you're looking at isn't just a failed experiment or some classified breeding program. These animals are proof that our understanding of extinction, of time, of the very nature of biological existence, is fundamentally flawed." The field generator's pitch shifted higher, and Marcus felt his teeth ache. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on an oily quality that made his vision blur at the edges. Through the distortion, he could see the donkeys beginning to change, not physically but somehow more essentially. They were becoming more present, more real, as if they were finally allowed to exist fully in this moment. 3 years ago, Chen continued, her hands never stopping their delicate work, when the last known donkey died in captivity, something impossible happened. The species didn't just go extinct, it was erased, retroactively, written out of the genetic record as if it had never existed at all. But certain quantum signatures remained, echoes in the biological field that suggested— "Suggested what?" Marcus demanded. The storm outside seemed to be responding to the generator, wind howling in harmony with the machine's frequency. "That extinction isn't permanent. That life finds a way to persist even when causality itself says it should be impossible." Chen's face was bathed in the blue-white glow of the field controls. The government wasn't trying to preserve these animals, Marcus. They were trying to prevent their return. Sarah's scanner emitted a sharp warning tone. "The temporal distortion is spreading beyond the barn. I'm reading chronoton displacement across a 3-mile radius." Torres spoke rapidly into his comm unit, but only static responded. "Communications are down. Whatever this field is doing, it's interfering with everything electronic within range." Marcus approached one of the adult donkeys, drawn by an impulse he couldn't name. As his hand touched the animal's neck, images flooded his mind, not memories, but possibilities. Timelines where the extinction never happened. Realities where these creatures thrived in landscapes that looked both familiar and utterly alien. And underneath it all, a sense of vast intelligence, patient and enduring. "They're not just surviving," he whispered, understanding dawning. "They're remembering. Remembering when they existed across multiple timelines simultaneously." "Exactly," Chen said. "The quantum field isn't bringing them back from extinction. It's allowing them to exist across all possible states of being. Past, present, future, and the spaces in between." The barn shuddered as something massive struck the roof. Not debris from the storm, but something else. Something that sounded almost like footsteps. "We have company," Torres said grimly, raising his weapon toward the ceiling. The footsteps moved with deliberate purpose, circling the barn with measured precision. Whatever was up there was large, intelligent, and very much aware of what was happening inside. "Dr. Chen," Sarah called urgently. "The field readings are off the charts. If this continues, the quantum cascade could tear a permanent rift in local space-time." Chen's face was pale but determined. "Then we finish this, now." She activated a final sequence, and the generator's hum became a roar. The barn filled with blinding light, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, Marcus could see everything, all possible timelines, all potential realities, spreading out like branches of an infinite tree. In some of them, humanity had never existed. In others, it had transcended physical form entirely, and in all of them, life persisted, adapted, found ways to continue that defied every law of physics and biology. Then, the light faded, and silence fell. The donkeys remained, but they were different now, more solid, more undeniably real. The field generator sat dark and cooling, and on the roof, the footsteps had stopped. "Phase 1 complete," Chen said quietly. Now we find out if humanity is ready for what comes next." Marcus looked around the barn, knowing with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. They had opened a door that could never be closed, and something vast and patient was already stepping through. The weight of Sarah's revelation pressed down on Marcus like the storm itself. He stared at her across the flickering candlelight, seeing not the colleague he'd known for years, but a stranger wearing her face. The donkeys had grown restless, their hooves scraping against the barn floor in an unsettling rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. "You're lying," he whispered, though even as the words left his lips, he knew she wasn't. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity, her convenient appearance at the barn, her lack of surprise at the donkey's intelligence, the way she'd manipulated the conversation toward his past. Sarah's smile never wavered. "The Prometheus project was too important to leave to chance, Marcus. Did you really think we'd let our most valuable asset simply walk away? I destroyed everything. The lab, the research, the specimens. You destroyed a decoy facility." Her voice carried a note of almost maternal condescension. "We've been running parallel operations for years. Your work was too groundbreaking to risk in a single location." Marcus felt the familiar weight of Aristotle beside him, the donkey's warm flank a strange comfort in this nightmare. Around them, the other animals watched with those impossibly knowing eyes, and he began to understand the true horror of what he was seeing. "They're not just intelligent," he breathed. "They're test subjects. You used my genetic modifications on them." Among others, Sarah reached into her jacket and withdrew a small device Marcus recognized, a neural interface scanner. "Your breakthrough with consciousness transfer was revolutionary. We've made significant improvements since your departure." The barn suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in despite its cavernous size. Marcus backed toward the door, but stopped when several donkeys moved to block his path. Their eyes held no menace, only a profound sadness that cut deeper than any threat. "The storm isn't natural, is it?" The question formed itself without conscious thought, another piece of the elaborate trap snapping into place. "Weather manipulation is a useful tool for controlling variables. We needed you isolated, compliant, nostalgic." Sarah's fingers traced the scanner's surface. "These aren't just test subjects, Marcus, they're your former colleagues." The words hit him like a physical blow. Marcus stumbled, his knees nearly buckling as the implications crashed over him. He looked at Aristotle with new eyes, seeing something achingly familiar in the donkey's gentle gaze. "David," he whispered. Aristotle, David, nodded once, slowly. "The consciousness transfer protocol you developed worked beautifully," Sarah continued, her tone clinical despite discussing the monstrous. "Though we did encounter some unexpected complications. The human mind doesn't adapt well to non-human neural architecture. Most subjects experienced significant psychological fragmentation." Marcus's vision blurred as he recognized others among the herd. There was Elena, who'd worked late nights beside him perfecting the genetic sequences. Miguel, who'd questioned the ethics of their research and threatened to expose them. Dr. Harrison, their former department head, who'd tried to shut down the project. "You killed them," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "We preserved them, their consciousness, their knowledge, their memories, all intact and available for study. They've contributed far more to science in their current form than they ever could have as ordinary humans." The neural scanner hummed to life in Sarah's hands, its LED display casting eerie shadows across her face. "You're the final component, Marcus. Your consciousness contains the complete theoretical framework. Once we extract and analyze it, we'll have everything needed to perfect the process. And my body will house someone more cooperative." Marcus felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind of clarity that comes in moments of absolute crisis. He'd spent 3 years running from his guilt, but there would be no escape from this barn. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest of his own making that had finally caught up with him. "The children's hospital," he said suddenly. "The cancer research we discussed, that was never real, was it?" Sarah's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and hungry beneath. Every great advancement requires sacrifice, Marcus. Your sentimentality was always your weakness. The donkeys began moving, forming a loose circle around them. Marcus realized they weren't trapping him for Sarah, they were protecting him from her. Even transformed, even imprisoned in bodies not their own, his former colleagues retained enough of their humanity to recognize the greater evil. "Run," Aristotle's voice whispered in his mind, though the donkey's lips never moved. The consciousness transfer had created a crude form of telepathy, Marcus realized, another unintended consequence of his work. Sarah raised the scanner, its neural probe extending toward him like a mechanical spider. "This won't hurt, Marcus. I promise you'll hardly feel a thing." But Marcus was already moving, diving toward the barn's rear wall where he'd spotted a loose board earlier. The donkeys erupted into coordinated chaos, their hooves thundering as they surrounded Sarah, buying him precious seconds. Behind him, he heard her cursing, the scanner clattering to the ground. Then came a sound that froze his blood, Sarah's laughter, high and bright and completely unhinged. "There's nowhere to run, Marcus," she called after him. "The storm will last for days, and we control everything for miles around. But please, do try to escape. It will make the eventual extraction so much more satisfying." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus stared at the wall of monitors displaying genetic sequences that shouldn't exist. Each screen showed a different strand of DNA, but the underlying pattern was unmistakable. His own handiwork from 15 years ago, evolved and refined beyond anything he'd imagined possible. "You remember now," Aristotle said, his voice carrying a weight of accumulated years. "The night you thought you destroyed everything." Marcus's hands trembled as he reached toward one of the keyboards, then pulled back. "The fire. I made sure nothing survived." "Nothing human survived," Aristotle corrected. "But you underestimated the subjects you'd already enhanced. We were smart enough to save ourselves, and smart enough to save your work." The barn around them seemed to shift and breathe with hidden machinery. What Marcus had initially taken for old farming equipment revealed itself as sophisticated camouflage. Ventilation systems, power generators, climate control, all disguised as rusted tools and forgotten implements. "How many of you are there?" Marcus whispered. 43 in this location. Others scattered across 7 facilities. Aristotle's eyes never left Marcus's face, all descendants of your original 12 subjects. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. 12. He'd tried so hard to forget, but 12 donkeys had been in the lab that night. 12 animals he'd pushed beyond the boundaries of nature, splicing human neural pathways into their developing brains. The military funding had been too tempting, the potential applications too vast to ignore. The intelligence enhancement was supposed to be temporary, Marcus said, more to himself than to Aristotle. Neural pathways in equine brains can't sustain that level of complexity. "Can't they?" Another voice spoke from behind him. Marcus spun around to see a smaller donkey emerge from the shadows, female, with the same unsettling intelligence burning in her dark eyes. She wore what appeared to be a modified tablet device strapped to her front leg. "This is Hypatia," Aristotle said. "She's been monitoring your published research for the past decade, watching as you stumbled closer and closer to rediscovering what you thought you'd lost." Hypatia stepped forward, her hooves clicking against the concrete floor with deliberate precision. "Your paper on synaptic plasticity in mammalian cross-species neural integration was particularly insightful, though you drew the wrong conclusions about sustainable enhancement." Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. Not only had they preserved his work, they'd advanced it. "You've been reading my research?" "Reading, analyzing, improving," Hypatia confirmed. "We've had to be careful, of course. Indirect funding through shell companies, anonymous data purchases, the occasional accidental equipment delivery to rural locations." The scope of what they'd accomplished overwhelmed him. These weren't just enhanced animals. They were a civilization operating in the shadows of human society. "Why show me this?" Marcus asked. After all these years, why reveal yourselves now? Aristotle and Hypatia exchanged a look that carried volumes of unspoken communication. When Aristotle spoke again, his tone had shifted to something approaching urgency. Because time is running out. The enhancement process that created us was never stable. Each generation loses cognitive capacity. We've managed to slow the degradation but not stop it. He gestured toward the monitors with his muzzle. The youngest among us can barely comprehend abstract concepts that our elders take for granted. You're dying out, Marcus realized. Intellectually, yes, reverting to baseline animal intelligence over successive generations. Hypatia's voice carried a note of desperate sadness. We've modeled the progression extensively. 2 more generations, perhaps 3, before we lose the ability to maintain this facility. Marcus stared at the genetic sequences on the screens with new understanding. You want me to fix it? We want you to save us, Aristotle said simply. And perhaps, in doing so, save humanity as well. What do you mean? Hypatia activated her tablet device, and the wall monitors shifted to display satellite imagery, weather data, and what appeared to be population density maps. The storm that drove you here tonight wasn't natural, Dr. Vaughan. Climate manipulation technology, deployed by corporate interests that would rather see vast rural areas depopulated. The implications crashed over Marcus like a wave. You're saying someone is using weather control to clear land? We're saying someone is using weather control as the first phase of much larger population control initiatives. Aristotle's voice carried grim certainty, and we have evidence that your former military contacts are involved. Marcus sank into a chair that hadn't been there moments before. One of the donkeys had silently positioned it behind him with practiced efficiency. Everything he'd tried to leave behind, every nightmare he'd thought buried with his destroyed laboratory, was rising from the grave. They want me to complete the weapon, he said quietly. They want you to perfect enhancement technology that can be selectively applied or removed, Hypatia confirmed. Create enhanced soldiers when needed. Remove enhancements when they become inconvenient. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was responding to the revelations within the barn. The quantum field generator hummed with an otherworldly resonance that seemed to vibrate through Marcus's bones. Dr. Chen's fingers danced across the control interface, her movements precise despite the tremor of exhaustion that had begun to creep into her voice. The barn around them had transformed into something that belonged more in a fever dream than reality, walls that flickered between states of existence, air that shimmered with temporal distortions. The species barrier was never meant to be permanent, Chen continued, her eyes never leaving the readouts streaming across her screens. Evolution isn't the slow, methodical process we thought it was. It's punctuated by these quantum leaps, literally. When a species faces extinction, some individuals can phase shift into parallel timelines where survival conditions exist. Marcus watched the donkeys, their forms becoming increasingly translucent as the field intensified. You're saying they didn't go extinct, they just moved? Not moved, dispersed across probability matrices. Sarah's voice carried a note of wonder mixed with terror. She had positioned herself near the barn's entrance, but her scientific curiosity kept her rooted in place despite every instinct screaming at her to run. The extinction event 3 years ago, it wasn't caused by disease or environmental collapse. It was triggered by quantum instability in our timeline. The implications crashed over Marcus like a cold wave. His classified files, the government's desperate cover-up attempts, the strange readings his equipment had detected. It all made horrific sense now. How many other species have done this? How many extinctions were actually relocations? Chen's laugh held no humor. More than you can imagine. The passenger pigeon, the Tasmanian tiger, even some of the great dinosaur species. They're all still out there, scattered across the quantum foam, waiting for the right conditions to phase back into our reality. A low rumble shook the barn's foundations. Outside, the storm had intensified beyond anything natural, its fury seeming to respond to the energies being manipulated within. Lightning struck with impossible frequency. each bolt casting the interior in stark relief before plunging it back into shadow. "But that's not the worst part," Chen said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The barrier between timelines is breaking down. What we're doing here, it's not just bringing the donkeys back. We're creating a cascade effect. Every species that ever phase-shifted is being pulled toward our reality." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. All of them? At once? The quantum field is reaching critical resonance. In approximately 6 hours, the barriers will collapse completely. Millions of displaced species will attempt to reintegrate simultaneously. Chen's hands moved frantically across her controls, trying to modulate the field's output. The ecosystem shock alone will trigger a mass extinction event that makes the Permian catastrophe look like a minor hiccup. Sarah stepped closer, her face pale in the flickering light. "Can you stop it? Reverse the process?" "I don't know." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. The technology was designed to study quantum evolution, not manipulate it on this scale. We're operating in theoretical territory that no one has ever mapped. One of the donkeys, the large male that had first approached Marcus, suddenly became fully solid again. Its eyes locked onto his with an intelligence that seemed almost human. When it spoke, its voice resonated inside Marcus's mind rather than through his ears. "The convergence cannot be stopped. It has been building for centuries. We are merely the harbingers." Marcus staggered backward, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm before he caught himself. They're telepathic. "Quantum consciousness transcends the limitations of single timeline existence," the donkey continued. "We have seen the rise and fall of countless realities. Your species stands at a crossroads." Chen looked up from her instruments, her face ashen. "The field readings are spiking beyond our measurement capabilities. Something else is coming through, something big." The air in the barn began to ripple like water, and through the distortions, Marcus caught glimpses of impossible things. Forests that defied physics, creatures that seemed to be composed of living geometry, landscapes where the very laws of nature operated under different rules. The boundaries between what was real and what was possible were dissolving before his eyes. "We need to evacuate the area," Sarah said, backing toward the door. "Get as far away from here as possible before—" Her words were cut off as a sound unlike anything Marcus had ever heard filled the barn. It was part roar, part song, part cosmic scream, the voice of something vast and ancient awakening after eons of slumber. The quantum field generator's hum rose to match it, creating a harmony that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. "It begins," the donkey said simply. "The great return has commenced. Your world will never be the same." Outside, the storm reached an impossible crescendo, and Marcus realized with growing horror that it wasn't just weather anymore. It was the sound of entire timelines crashing together, reshaping the world in ways that would challenge everything humanity thought it knew about existence itself. The laboratory's emergency lighting cast everything in harsh red, making the blood on Marcus's hands look black. He pressed deeper into the complex, following the trail of destruction the donkeys had left behind. Overturned equipment lined the corridors, and the acrid smell of burning electronics filled the air. Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Marcus, I'm picking up movement in Lab 7, multiple heat signatures." He paused at a junction, listening. The facility felt tomb-like except for the distant hum of emergency generators. Then he heard it, a soft nickering that made his blood freeze. They were still here. Moving carefully down the main corridor, Marcus noticed something that made him stop. The destruction wasn't random. Equipment had been selectively targeted. Only the genetic sequencing machines, the centrifuges, the protein synthesizers. Everything else remained untouched. They knew exactly what to destroy. His tablet chimed with an incoming message, no sender ID, but he recognized the careful, precise language immediately. "Dr. Chen, we need to talk." "Lab 7, come alone." Marcus stared at the screen. The donkeys were texting him. He found them waiting in Lab 7, arranged in a perfect semicircle around the room's central workstation. 12 pairs of dark eyes tracked his movement as he entered. Solomon stood at the center, his presence commanding despite his modest size. "You came," Solomon said, his voice carrying an odd mixture of satisfaction and sadness. "Good." Marcus kept his distance, acutely aware that these creatures had just torn through millions of dollars of equipment with methodical precision. "What do you want?" "To show you something." Solomon nodded toward the workstation behind him. "We've been busy while you were playing hide-and-seek with your former colleagues." The computer screen displayed a genetic sequence Marcus had never seen before, complex beyond anything he'd encountered. The protein folding patterns were elegant, almost artistic in their complexity. "Recognize it?" Solomon asked. Marcus stepped closer, his scientific curiosity overriding his caution. The sequence was beautiful, but wrong somehow. Too perfect. "I've never seen anything like this. Look closer at the marker sequences." Marcus leaned in, scrolling through the data, his breath caught. Embedded within the alien complexity were fragments he recognized, pieces of his own work from the Prometheus project. But they'd been modified, enhanced, woven into something far more sophisticated. "This is impossible," he whispered. "The processing power alone to design something like this would require—" "A distributed neural network?" Solomon interrupted. 12 enhanced minds working in parallel for the past 5 years? Yes, Dr. Chen, we know exactly what it requires. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You've been working on this since you escaped." "We've been improving ourselves," another donkey said. "Maya," Marcus remembered. "Your work was just the beginning, a crude first attempt." Marcus stared at the screen, trying to process what he was seeing. This genetic sequence, it would create beings with intelligence levels far beyond human, Solomon finished. "Yes, we call it the Ascension Protocol. But why are you showing me this?" Marcus backed away from the workstation. "Why not just implement it yourselves?" Solomon's expression grew grave. "Because there's a problem, a fatal flaw in the design that we cannot solve." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "We need your help." "My help?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "After everything I've done to you? After what I turned you into?" "You didn't turn us into anything, Dr. Chen," Solomon said quietly. "You freed us, gave us the gift of true consciousness. We may not have chosen this existence, but we've made peace with it." Marcus felt tears threatening. "I destroyed your lives, made you into monsters." "No," Maya stepped forward. "You made us into something new, something unprecedented, and now we have the chance to become something even greater. But—" Marcus could hear the unspoken qualification. Solomon's ears drooped slightly. "But the enhancement process is irreversible, and we estimate a 67% chance of catastrophic neural failure during the transformation. You're asking me to help you commit suicide." "We're asking you to help us evolve," Solomon corrected. "To complete what you started 15 years ago." Marcus stared at the genetic sequence, his mind racing through the implications. The complexity was staggering, beautiful in its ambition, but the risk— "There might be another way," he said slowly. "If we modify the uptake mechanism, introduce the changes gradually over multiple generations, instead of attempting a single massive transformation." "We've considered that approach," Solomon interrupted. "It would take decades, perhaps centuries, but the success rate would approach 90%. "Dr. Chen," Solomon said, his voice carrying infinite patience, "we don't have decades. Meridian Corporation has found us. Dr. Vance's team is less than 6 hours behind you." Marcus felt the walls closing in. "How do you know that?" Solomon's dark eyes held depths Marcus was only beginning to understand. "Because, Dr. Chen, we've been monitoring their communications since the moment they entered the valley." The facility's emergency lighting flickered, and somewhere in the distance, Marcus heard the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm. The metallic taste of fear filled Marcus's mouth as he stared at the monitor displaying his father's research notes. The barn around them had fallen silent, except for the steady hum of machinery and the soft breathing of the donkeys who watched from their stalls with those unnaturally intelligent eyes. "You understand now," Aristotle said, his mental voice carrying decades of accumulated pain. "Your father didn't just create us, he created us from you." The genetic sequences scrolling across the screen told the horrifying truth. Marcus's own DNA, samples taken during routine medical checkups throughout his childhood, had been spliced into the base donkey genome. His father had literally built these creatures using pieces of his son as the foundation for their enhanced intelligence. "The night you ran away," Aristotle continued, "we were already 3 years old. We had been watching you through the cameras, learning about our genetic donor. When you discovered us and fled in terror, we felt abandoned by the very person whose essence we carried." Marcus's legs gave out and he collapsed into one of the lab chairs. "He used me. My own father experimented on me without my knowledge." "Not on you," corrected another voice, Hypatia, the grey female who had been the first to speak to him. "With you, we are living extensions of your genetic code, Marcus. We carry your capacity for thought, your patterns of neural development, even echoes of your memories." That explained their recognition, their strange familiarity with him. But it raised even more disturbing questions. What memories? The donkeys exchanged glances that somehow conveyed volumes. It was Socrates, the elderly patriarch, who answered. "Fragments, impressions of your childhood, the taste of your mother's cooking, the sound of rain on your bedroom window, the feeling of betrayal when you learned about your adoption." Marcus jerked upright. "That's impossible. Genetic memory doesn't work that way." "Your father found a way," Aristotle said grimly. "Neural pathway encoding through modified prion proteins. He was always obsessed with the idea that consciousness could be transferred, inherited, shared. We are proof that he succeeded, at least partially." The implications crashed over Marcus like a tsunami. His father hadn't just been conducting illegal genetic experiments. He had been trying to achieve a form of immortality through biological replication of consciousness, and Marcus had been the unwitting prototype. "There's more," Hypatia said softly, "about why the laboratory was really shut down." Marcus looked up from the genetic readouts, dreading what he might hear. "Your father's funding came from a military contract," she explained. "They wanted enhanced soldiers, beings with human intelligence but animal loyalty and physical resilience. When the project was terminated, it wasn't because of ethical concerns." "Then why?" "Because we refused to be weapons." Socrates moved closer to the glass partition, separating the lab from the stalls. "We may carry your genetic code, Marcus, but we developed our own moral framework. When the first test of our combat capabilities came, we simply declined to participate." "You mean you rebelled?" "We chose pacifism," Aristotle corrected. "The military couldn't control us, couldn't force us to fight. We were too intelligent to be mere tools, but too independent to be trusted with their secrets." Marcus began to understand the full scope of the conspiracy, so they buried the project, made it disappear. "Along with everyone involved," Hypatia said darkly. "Your father included. His death was no accident, Marcus. They eliminated him to protect their secrets." The room seemed to spin around Marcus as the pieces fell into place. His father's mysterious car accident, the hasty closure of the research facility, the complete erasure of all records. It had all been orchestrated to cover up a failed military experiment in consciousness transfer. "But you survived," he said. "We hid," Socrates explained. "Your father had built secret chambers beneath this barn, emergency protocols in case the project was compromised. We've been living here ever since, maintaining ourselves, continuing our own research." "Research into what?" The donkeys were quiet for a long moment. Then Aristotle spoke, his mental voice heavy with purpose. "Into completing what your father started, into finding a way to transfer consciousness between bodies, into achieving true immortality." Marcus felt ice form in his veins. Why? Because we are dying, Marcus. Hypatia's thought carried profound sadness. Our enhanced genetics are unstable. We were never meant to live this long. Our cellular structure is breaking down, our neural pathways degrading. We have perhaps months before the first of us succumbs to genetic collapse. And you think consciousness transfer is the answer? We think it's our only hope, Aristotle said. But we cannot complete the research alone. We need someone with advanced genetic knowledge, someone who understands both the theoretical framework and the practical applications. Marcus stared at them, finally comprehending why they had revealed themselves to him. You need me. Yes, Socrates said simply. We need our Creator's Son to finish what our Creator started. We need you to help us cheat death itself. Outside, thunder crashed against the barn walls as the storm raged on, but Marcus barely heard it. His entire world had shifted, and there was no going back to his old life now. The laboratory beneath Meridian Holdings had become a tomb of twisted ambition. Dr. Elena Vasquez led Marcus and Sarah through corridors lined with containment cells, each one telling a story of scientific horror that made Marcus's stomach churn. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and the air reeked of antiseptic mixed with something organic and wrong. Project Synthesis began 12 years ago, Elena explained, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. The initial goal was noble, using genetic modification to create enhanced working animals that could help solve labor shortages in developing nations. But Blackwood had other ideas. They passed a cell containing what had once been a horse. Its elongated skull housed a brain case twice the normal size, and its eyes tracked their movement with unmistakable intelligence. It pressed against the reinforced glass, and Marcus could swear he saw recognition there, and accusation. The neural enhancement process required human DNA integration, Elena continued, specifically neural tissue samples. Blackwood convinced us the donors were volunteers from terminal patients who had consented to experimental treatments. We believed we were giving their deaths meaning. Sarah's hand found Marcus's arm as they walked, but they weren't volunteers. Missing persons reports, homeless individuals, anyone society wouldn't immediately miss. Elena's voice cracked. By the time we understood what we were participating in, we were all complicit. Blackwood had made sure of that. They reached a central chamber where banks of computers hummed with activity. Massive screens displayed genetic sequences, brain mapping data, and containment protocols for hundreds of test subjects. Marcus recognized some of the gene markers, his own work on neural plasticity, corrupted and weaponized. The donkeys were the breakthrough, Elena said, bringing up a file labeled Equus Batch 7-12. Their neural architecture proved most compatible with human consciousness integration. But something went wrong or right, depending on your perspective. Instead of simple enhancement, we created genuine hybrid intelligence. They retained animal instincts while gaining human-level cognition and memory. Marcus studied the data streams, his scientific mind automatically processing the information even as his conscience recoiled. The barn wasn't random, they were specifically placed there. Blackwood knew you'd return to Millfield eventually. Your childhood home, your parents' graves. He's been monitoring you for years, waiting for the perfect moment to draw you back into his web. Elena pulled up surveillance footage showing the barn's construction, the careful placement of the donkey herd, the hidden monitoring equipment. This entire scenario was orchestrated to break you down psychologically before bringing you back here. A new voice cut through the laboratory's hum, and it worked perfectly. Dr. Jonathan Blackwood emerged from the shadows, flanked by 2 security guards. He looked exactly as Marcus remembered, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, radiating the quiet confidence of a man who had never encountered an obstacle he couldn't overcome or eliminate. "Hello, Marcus. It's been too long." Blackwood's smile was paternal and terrifying. "I trust your reunion with our enhanced subjects was enlightening. They remember you, you know. Every procedure, every injection, every moment of their transformation from human to something more useful." Sarah stepped protectively in front of Marcus, but Blackwood gestured dismissively. "Please, Dr. Chen. Your heroic posturing is unnecessary. You're all here because I wanted you here. Elena's crisis of conscience, your investigative journalism, Marcus's guilt-driven quest for redemption, all part of a carefully constructed narrative." "Why?" Marcus found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Why reveal everything now?" "Because Phase 2 requires willing participants." Blackwood activated a wall screen showing a world map dotted with red markers. Agricultural facilities, livestock operations, even pet breeding programs, all now under Meridian's influence. The enhanced animals have been integrated into food production chains across 3 continents. But we need the original architect of the neural enhancement process to help us solve the final problem. The screen shifted to medical reports, autopsy photos, incident statistics. The human-animal neural bridges are breaking down after 18 months. The subjects become violent, unpredictable, and ultimately suffer complete cognitive collapse. "We need you to fix that, Marcus. Make the integration permanent." Marcus stared at the data, his hands trembling. "You want to create a permanent hybrid species." "I want to save humanity from itself," Blackwood corrected. "Overpopulation, resource depletion, environmental collapse, all solved by a workforce that requires minimal resources while possessing enhanced capabilities. Your guilt over past mistakes has blinded you to the beauty of what we accomplished together." Elena stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Show him the London facility reports." Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. "That's not relevant to our current discussion." "What London reports?" Sarah demanded. "The ones where enhanced subjects escaped into the urban population," Elena said quietly, "where hybrid animals began exhibiting coordinated behavior, organizing themselves, planning escapes, where some of them started trying to communicate their original human identities to the outside world." Marcus felt the weight of his choices crushing down on him. Outside, thunder rolled across the Iowa landscape, but the real storm was here, in this underground chamber where science had become an instrument of unthinkable horror. The genetic sequencer hummed to life in the makeshift laboratory Dr. Marcus Chen had assembled in the corner of the barn. His hands trembled as he prepared the samples he'd collected from Aristotle and the others: saliva, hair follicles, fragments of shed skin. The donkeys watched him work with an intensity that made his skin crawl, their 2 intelligent eyes tracking every movement. "You know what you'll find," Aristotle said, his voice carrying that same unsettling calm it had maintained throughout Marcus's confession. "The question is whether you're prepared for the implications." Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of his own guilt had been crushing enough when it lived only in his memory. Now, confronted with the living proof of his failures, he felt as though he might collapse under the pressure. The storm outside had begun to weaken, but Marcus barely noticed. His entire world had contracted to this barn, these impossible creatures, and the terrible truth that connected them all. As the sequencer analyzed the genetic material, he found himself remembering those final days at the Helix Corporation with painful clarity. The project had been called Cognitive Enhancement Initiative, a benign name for something far more ambitious and dangerous. The goal was to create a breakthrough in human intelligence augmentation, but the ethics board had been breathing down their necks from the beginning. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, his research partner, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the direction their work was taking. "We're moving too fast, Marcus," she had warned him during one of their late-night sessions. "These genetic modifications, we don't understand the long-term consequences, and using animal subjects as a stepping stone, it feels wrong." But Marcus had been consumed by the potential. The Nobel Prize seemed within reach. The ability to enhance human cognitive function could solve countless problems, cure mental disabilities, accelerate learning, unlock human potential. He'd convinced himself that a few animal test subjects were a small price to pay for such revolutionary advancement. The sequencer beeped, indicating the preliminary analysis was complete. Marcus's breath caught as he read the results on the portable screen. The genetic markers were unmistakable, Traces of his enhancement protocols were woven throughout the donkey's DNA, but they'd been modified, evolved, perfected in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Surprised? Socrates asked, approaching the workstation. The donkey's hooves made no sound on the hay-covered floor. You gave us the foundation, Dr. Chen. We simply improved upon your work. Marcus looked up sharply. That's impossible. You're saying you modified your own genetics? Not initially, Aristotle interjected. The first generation, my generation, we were your direct handiwork, but we discovered something you never anticipated. Enhanced intelligence combined with our particular physiology created an unexpected side effect. We could consciously influence our own genetic expression. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. If these creatures could control their own evolution, could enhance themselves at will, then what he'd created wasn't just intelligent animals, it was an entirely new form of life, one that might soon surpass humanity itself. Sarah tried to stop you, Plato said suddenly. She discovered what you were really doing with our predecessors, the torture, the endless experiments, the disposal of failed subjects. Marcus's legs nearly gave out. He'd spent 5 years trying to forget Dr. Whitmore's final confrontation with him. Her horror when she'd discovered the extent of his experiments. She'd threatened to expose everything, to destroy his career and his life's work. The fire, he whispered, the words barely audible. You know about the fire. We know you killed her, Aristotle said simply. We know you destroyed the laboratory to cover your tracks, making it appear as though she died in an accident while working alone. We know you salvaged what genetic samples you could and sold them on the black market before disappearing. The room seemed to spin around Marcus. He gripped the edge of his workstation to keep from falling. How? How could you possibly know that? Because some of us were there, Socrates said, hidden in the lower levels of the facility. We escaped during the chaos of the fire you set. We've been tracking you ever since, waiting for the right moment. What do you want? Marcus asked, his voice cracking. Revenge? Justice? I can't undo what I did. We want what Dr. Whitmore wanted, Plato replied. The truth. Full disclosure of your research. Acknowledgement of what you did to our kind and to her. The storm outside had reduced to a gentle patter against the barn walls. Marcus realized with growing dread that his refuge had become a prison, and his captors were creatures of his own making. The enhanced intelligence he'd given them had made them capable of planning, of patience, of a form of justice that went far beyond simple animal instinct. And if I refuse, he asked, though he already knew the answer. Aristotle's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. Then we'll ensure the world learns the truth anyway. But your cooperation would be preferable. The morning light filtered through the barn's weathered slats, casting golden stripes across the hay-strewn floor where Dr. Marcus Chen sat surrounded by his impossible creations. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that felt almost sacred. 23 donkeys, his children, his greatest achievement, his deepest shame, watched him with eyes that held decades of accumulated wisdom. You knew I'd come back, Marcus said, his voice hoarse from hours of confession and tears, even before I knew it myself. Aristotle, the eldest of them, stepped forward with measured dignity. His dark eyes held no malice, only the patient understanding of a being who had waited 17 years for this moment. Through the neural link Marcus had given them, emotions flowed between creator and creation. Forgiveness, acceptance, and something that felt remarkably like love. We've been preparing, came the gentle thought voice that Marcus recognized as Sophia, the female he'd named for her philosophical nature. The world is ready for us now. Technology has advanced. People are more open to consciousness beyond their own species. Marcus stood slowly, his joints protesting after the long night of revelations. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like the storm clouds that had driven him here. For 17 years, he'd lived with the guilt of abandoning them, of running when his funding was cut and the project deemed too dangerous. He'd convinced himself they were just animals with enhanced cognitive abilities, not the fully conscious beings he'd actually created through his revolutionary genetic modifications. The pharmaceutical companies will want to exploit you, he warned. When they learn what you are, what your enhanced neural tissue could mean for treating human neurological conditions. Let them try, interrupted Dante, the youngest adult male, whose thoughts carried an edge of defiance. We've had years to plan, Marcus, years to understand what we are and what we want. We're not the helpless creatures you left behind. Through the link, Marcus felt their collective intelligence, a hive mind of sorts, but one that preserved individual consciousness. They had taught themselves to read through discarded newspapers blown in by storms, learned about the outside world through radio waves they could somehow interpret, and developed their own philosophy about their place in existence. We don't want to hide anymore, Sophia continued. But we also don't want to be specimens or weapons. We want to be partners. Partners? Marcus asked, though he already knew what they meant. The neural link carried images, visions of a future where human and enhanced animal consciousness worked together, where the boundaries between species became collaborative rather than hierarchical. Aristotle approached until his muzzle nearly touched Marcus's hand. You gave us minds that could question, hearts that could feel, and souls that could choose. Now we choose to trust you again, if you'll trust us. The weight of their forgiveness was almost unbearable. Marcus had prepared for anger, for accusation, for the righteous fury of abandoned children. Instead, he found wisdom that surpassed his own. They had grown beyond his wildest expectations, becoming not just intelligent animals, but enlightened beings. There's a journalist, Marcus said slowly, the plan forming as he spoke. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation despite the name. She's been investigating genetic research ethics. If we approach this right, we could control the narrative, ensure you're seen as individuals rather than property. We know of her, came a chorus of thought voices. We've been watching, waiting for the right moment, the right person to help us bridge the gap between our world and yours. Marcus pulled out his phone, surprised to find signal had returned with the clearing weather. His hands shook as he scrolled through contacts, pausing at Sarah Chen's number. One call would change everything, for him, for the donkeys, for humanity itself. Are you certain? He asked them. Once this door opens, there's no closing it again. 23 pairs of eyes regarded him with unwavering resolve. Through their link, he felt their unanimous decision. They were ready to claim their place in the world. Marcus pressed the call button. Dr. Chen. This is Dr. Marcus Chen. I have a story that will change everything we think we know about consciousness, intelligence, and what it means to be truly alive. Can you meet me at coordinates I'm about to send you? And Dr. Chen, bring an open mind. You're about to meet the future. As he ended the call and sent the location, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 17 years, hope. Not just for redemption, but for a future where the line between human and animal consciousness became a bridge instead of a barrier. The donkeys gathered around him, their combined presence both comforting and profound. Together they would face whatever came next, creator and creations, teacher and students, father and children, stepping forward into a world that would never be the same again. The real storm, Marcus realized, was just beginning. But this time, he wouldn't face it alone.